This presentation looks at the idea of GDP per capita and investigates or looks at whether GDP per capita is actually a good way of measuring and comparing the standard of living of two populations in two countries, or looking at the development of standard of living within a country over time. So let's look at the idea of GDP per capita. We already know that we've been talking about total GDP per year as whether it tells us anything about standard of living or welfare. Now, total GDP is and is not a good measure of standard of living or welfare. And one of the reasons it's not is that it tells us nothing about the distribution of national income. It doesn't really tell us about how the total income earned in a country within 1 year is actually spread or distributed among the population. So even if total GDP is rising, the income may be very unequally distributed, and this may mean that the standard of living of the majority of the population is not rising. So we have a problem with total GDP as a measure of welfare. And this problem is the fact of income distribution, which may be very unequal. So is there anything we can do to improve on this and give a better indication of welfare from GDP? Well, one of the things that's been suggested is that we convert the total GDP into what's called a GDP per capita, which is the total GDP divided by the population. So let's see how this works. Imagine that the GDP of the UK in 1 year was roughly $2 trillion, and that the population of the UK was at that time 58 million people. If we take 2 trillion and divide it by 58 million, we get a figure of roughly $34,000 per person per year. So what we're saying is that, roughly speaking, on average, every person in the UK would have had an income of $34,000. Now, is this realistic? Well, if we said that it was a good measure, what could we do with it? We could look at the GDP per capita over time and see what it was doing. So, for example, if the GDP per capita was increasing over time, we may be able to say that the standard of living of people in the UK was rising. That's one thing we could do by looking at GDP per capita numbers in a particular economy. We could also compare the GDP per capita in the UK with the GDP per capita in another country, shall we say the USA, and these numbers could tell us something about the relative standard of living between people in one economy and people in another economy. So there are potential uses of GDP per capita, but the real question is, does it improve on total GDP as a measure of welfare or standard of living? Is it an improvement? Well, the point is that GDP per capita is an average or mean. If we take the total GDP of a country and divide it by its population, what we are calculating is the average or mean income of everyone in that economy. So this figure of $34,000 that we came up with for the GDP per capita of the UK assumes that actually the total national income of the UK is absolutely equally distributed between everyone in the UK. So this $34,000 is only a meaningful figure if we assume that everyone in the UK has an equal share of the national income, an absolutely equal share, because it's an average. Now, that clearly is not realistic, so we have to see if we've made any kind of improvement. We started with measuring total GDP and said that that really gave us no idea at all about income distribution. So where have we gone from there? We've gone to GDP per capita, and that actually assumes that the income is absolutely equally distributed between everyone in the population. So we've gone from a situation where we had absolutely no idea about income distribution to a situation where we're assuming that income is absolutely equally distributed, which is also unrealistic. So we've gone from having no idea to making an unrealistic assumption. So you could say that it's not really such a step forward if we move from total GDP as our measure of welfare, total GDP, to GDP per capita. So changing from total GDP to GDP per capita may not actually be seen as anything particularly worthwhile, or an improvement in our understanding of the welfare of people in the economy. So is there anything better than GDP per capita? Is there anything that we can do which actually tells us a little bit more about how the standard of living of people is developing over time? Well, what we could do is we could measure household income per year, and we could rank the household income from the lowest to the highest. So in any one particular year, we could measure the income of every household in our economy, and then we could lay out the information so that we had the lowest household income on one end and the highest household income on the other end. If we took the household income that was exactly in the middle, that is to say, an equal number of households earned less and an equal number of households earned more, that would be called the median household income. The median household income. And that is actually a better, if we find that number, that is actually a better measure of the typical standard of living of someone in our economy than taking GDP per capita. So we've seen the problems with GDP per capita. It assumes absolutely equal income distribution. And that just doesn't happen in most economies. In fact, in any economy, it doesn't happen. Income is not equally distributed. We do not have equal income distribution. So GDP per capita, which assumes absolute income distribution, equal income distribution, is a very faulty measure. And it doesn't really progress us from measuring total GDP. But a better way of doing it is by measuring what we call the median household income. So if we find the household income of every household in the economy, in the country, and we lay them out from lowest to highest, and we find the one which is exactly in the middle, that is probably the best way that we can have of measuring standard of living as it develops over time in an economy.